Professor Williamson. This is a presentation to go over the two case studies found at the end of chapter 5. The first one is an 86-year-old lady with a left bundle intermittent complete heart block, first degree AV block, and syncope. She's coming in for an implementation of a permanent pacemaker. When you review all of the clinical documentation after the word procedure in your textbook, you will pick out some key words, which we'll go over in a second. It's also helpful if you understand what a pacemaker is. A pacemaker has a main component, which is a disc-like shape, in this case a silver, and then it has two leads. This patient had a dual chamber pacemaker. There's two leads coming off of the pacemaker. The pacemaker is put in one location. The leads are put in two different locations. So if we look at the clinical information in your textbook, it tells us that her left chest was prepped, an incision was made on her left delta pectoral groove, a venototomy was made, and the Medtronic model, which is the pacemaker, was placed percutaneously into the right ventricular apex. A Medtronic model lead was placed percutaneous in the high right atrium. So this patient had the base model, the silver component was placed in her subcutaneous area of her chest, and a lead was placed into her right ventricular, and another lead was placed into her right atrium. So we have three different anatomical locations, and then per what we learned in chapter 2, we would then need three separate ICD-10 and PCS codes. The next step in our coding process for what we learned back in chapter 1 is to identify what is our intention or objective of this procedure, and that is to place a pacemaker in this patient. That's how we get to our root operation. We then take that information and we decide, or we match it up with the root operation definitions we are given. In this case, you could look at the root operations that are highlighted for you in chapter 5, and one of those is insertion. Insertion is defined by the ICD-10 PCS coding system as putting in a non-biological device that monitors, assists, performs, or prevents a physiological function but does not physically take the place of a body part. In this case, the pacemaker is a non-biological device that is going to assist heart function. So our main term is insertion, which is also our root operation. We're going to index the main term of insertion, then we have of device in our alpha index, then the anatomy, subcutaneous tissue and chest. That was the first part that was placed in her body, was that silver disc. We are then given 0JH6 in our alpha index. We move to the 0JH table. And once you're there, you want to just verify and check, review that 6 is the correct body part value that you want to choose based on the options that you have at that table and your clinical documentation. The next character value in the code structure of ICD-10 PCS is for surgical approach. For your clinical information, back in the operative report, the placement of that disc was made via an incision. Therefore, we know based on what we learned back in chapter 1 that an incision is going to relate to the surgical approach of open. And at that table and at that row, the identification of open is by the character value of 0. The next character value in our code structure is for device. Was a device left in this patient at the conclusion of this procedure? Yes. Therefore, we need to reflect something other than Z. Z means no device, but that's not true in this case. This device that is being left in this patient is called a dual chamber pacemaker. Therefore, when we're at our row and at our table, we have options, and we're going to choose the one that is identified as pacemaker dual chamber, which ends up being the character value of 6. Then we move to our last character value, which is for qualifier, and the only option we have at that row at that table is Z. So we end up with the final code for the insertion of the pacemaker into this patient's chest, 0JH606Z. However, as we noted above, a pacemaker doesn't work without leads. They have to go somewhere. Patient can have a single chamber pacemaker, just one lead, but this patient had two. So if we code this based on the documentation sequence in terms of we code what was done after the pacemaker was placed, the first lead was placed into the patient's right ventricle. So we're going to index the main term in the alpha index of ICD-10 pieces coding manual. We'll index the main term of insertion. Then the subterm is the anatomy, which is the ventricle right. We're given 0 to HK in the alpha. We move again to the 02H table. We verify our body part value. It still is K. Then we move to our surgical approach. The surgical approach per the clinical documentation was percutaneous. We choose 3 because that reflects percutaneous at that table. Was a device left in the patient? That's our next character value. The answer is yes. What type of device? Now in this case, it's not the pacemaker because we already coded that. We're coding the lead. So we choose a pacemaker lead, which relates to character value of J at the 02H table in that first row. Then we move across the row. The last character value is for qualifier. There's only one option, Z. So the code for the insertion of a lead from the pacemaker to the patient's right ventricle is 02HK3JZ. Then the last code is for the lead being placed in the patient's right atrium. The same indexing pathway. The main term, root operation, is insertion. Then the anatomy is your second step. Atrium, then right. You're given 02H6 in the alpha. You move to the 02H table. You review and check your body part value. It's still going to be 6. Then you want to code or choose your surgical approach, which was documented as percutaneous. The option that reflects that on that table is 3. Was a device left in the patient? Yes. We're coding the second lead. The character value that reflects that is J. Then the last character value on that row is still Z, the only option. So our final code for our insertion of a lead into the patient's right atrium is 02H63JZ. The only difference between these two codes is the fourth character value. One reflects ventricle right, and the other one reflects atrium right. So we end up with these 3 codes for this particular one procedure. And in this case, there is no guideline that says you couldn't have these codes in a different sequence. You could have this code first, this code second, but this presentation, this order that you're seeing on your screen is based on the order that was given to us in the documentation. The pacemaker was put in first, then the lead was into the ventricle, and then the lead into the atrium. Moving to exercise number 2, operative report number 2. This patient's having a removal of an infected central venous catheter. Again, if we go back to our coding process, the first step after we review the clinical documentation is to determine what is the intention or objective of the procedure. The intention was to remove this infected catheter from this patient. And we have to match that up with a root operation definition. The best match is the root operation of removal. Per ICD-10 PCS, removal is defined as taking out or off a device from a body part. Then we need to look at the clinical documentation because we need to know the anatomy and the surgical approach. The key words from that operative report include the subcutaneous tissue attached to the catheter was spread and percutaneously divided. Sharply under the central venous catheter was free and removed from the superior vena cava, and the tunneled catheter was removed from the subcutaneous layer of the chest. Therefore, we have 2 anatomical locations. We have the superior vena cava, which is a vein, a very large vein near your heart, and the skin at the subcutaneous level of the chest. You can code these in either order. In this case, I coded this chest first. So we're going to code, we're going to index the main term of removal. Then you have removal of device from, and then anatomical information. In this case, subcutaneous tissue and fascia. Location specifically in our clinical information was chest. However, there's no designation of chest. So we would choose the word that is a synonym or is commonly used in anatomy for chest, which is trunk. We're then given 0JPT in the alpha index of ICD-10 PCS. You move to the 0JP table. You have your body part value already from the alpha. You're going to double check that information. Then you're going to decide on your surgical approach. Your surgical approach for your documentation was percutaneous. At that table, at that row, that's reflected by the value of 3. Was a device left in the patient? No. Was the device touched or removed by the surgeon? Yes. Then we need to reflect something other than 0. So when we look at our choices, we have to decide or choose what is the type of device. The type of device for our clinical information is a central venous catheter. Venous and vein are two very similar words in medical terminology. So if you don't know, you could obviously look it up in your medical dictionary or Google the word central venous catheter to get a definition. But a central venous catheter is a vascular access device. So we would choose X for that character value at that row. Then we move across. The only option for a qualifier is Z. So our final code, the removal of a catheter from the subcutaneous skin of the patient's chest or trunk, is 0JP-T3XZ. Then we need a second code. We need a code for the removal of a catheter, or the removal of the portion of the catheter from the patient's superior vena cava. This is a picture, so you understand the anatomy. The superior vena cava is this blue, large vein. You also, in this case, have to understand why, when we get into the coding of it, you have to understand why a person would have a central line or venous catheter put in. But here we go with indexing. Removal of device from where? If you look up superior vena cava, there is no subterm superior vena cava under removal. You could then choose to look at, okay, I know it anatomically, it's near the heart, I could choose that. Or you could say, well, maybe I'll look for synonyms. I'll look for something that means superior. And if you do that, you'll find synonym of great and then vessel, which is what vena cava means. When you look under great vessel, you're given 02PY. If you look under heart, you're going to get in the alpha 02PA. But let's just say you used heart because you didn't think about the synonym thing. So you got 02PA, you move to 02P table. When you get to the 02P table, there's 4 rows. 2 of them for heart and for the body part value, and 2 of them for great vessel. Was this catheter removed from the patient's heart? The answer to that is no. This is the heart down here. This is the vena cava. It's outside of the heart. So once you get to the 02P table, as a coder, critical thinking would kick in and you would choose the better option. And once you're at the table, you would choose great vessel, because that is really where this particular catheter was taken from. Then you're going to choose the surgical approach. It was documented this was done percutaneously. That's reflected by the value of 3 at that 02P table, in this case the 3rd row. Was a device left in the patient? No. A device was removed in this case. So we need a positive value for that. We need something other than Z. You have various options. You have 2, 3, 7, 8, C, D, J, and K at that particular table, at that row. And the distinction between those is what type of device was it. You don't see central venous catheter there in those options. So you have to then either know what it is or you have to look up the information. In this case, you could go a variety of places. I went to the WebMD just to give you an idea where you could get this information. You may know the information. You may have experience with this. Someone in your family may have had a central line, which is another term for venous catheter. But per WebMD, a central venous catheter is used to provide blood, fluids, and other substances to a patient over the long term. So you might see these in cancer patients, young and old, children who have leukemia. Typically will have a central line put in because they want to have easier access instead of having to put it into their arm veins, and they want to get the drugs into them faster for the fluids or the blood. So a central line or a central venous catheter is an infusion route. Therefore, we're going to choose option 3 at that particular character value for device. And then our last choice is made for us at the table. The only option we have is Z. So the final code for the removal of a catheter from the subcutaneous location via subcutaneous from the location of the superior vena cava or great vessel is 02PY33Z. So you have 2 codes for this particular procedure. And this is the reference to the WebMD site and of course your textbook. If you have any questions on this presentation, please let me know.